Ukraine's refinery strikes push Russia toward fuel chaos and mobilization crisis. In the last 24 hours, a new fault line has opened inside the Russian Federation. It is not a fault line traced by shifting front lines or sudden battlefield collapses, but by something more fundamental: fuel shortages, crumbling logistics, mounting financial strain, and the growing possibility of mass unrest. As refineries burn and key infrastructure is hit deep behind the front, Russian volunteers fighting for Ukraine warn that the Kremlin may soon face a choice it can no longer avoid. Either it launches a new wave of mobilization and risks crippling its own economy, or it holds back and watches its military pressure slowly unravel along the entire front. Behind this binary lies a deeper, more volatile question. What happens to a country when its oil industry, its workforce, and its political narrative all begin to crack at the same time? How does a state built on the promise of stability and energy dominance respond when the very pipelines that sustain it become vulnerabilities rather than strengths? Today at 5:10 a.m., assessments from Ukrainian and Russian volunteer analysts converged on a single stark conclusion. The strikes on Russian oil refineries and energy infrastructure are no longer isolated incidents or symbolic gestures. They are evolving into a coherent, sustained pressure mechanism, one designed to weaken the Russian economy, disrupt fuel logistics, and amplify public discontent inside the Russian Federation. These views were articulated in detail by a Russian volunteer fighter known by the call sign Caesar, whose real name is Maxim Leon Androniko. Once a fitness coach in Sochi and St. Petersburg, he now serves on the opposite side of the war, fighting for Ukraine. His unique position, a Russian national embedded with Ukrainian forces, offered a rare and clear window into the operational logic behind Ukraine's long-range targeting campaign and the political vulnerabilities emerging inside Russia. By 6 a.m., Caesar had emphasized that Ukraine's continued strikes on refineries are now functioning as the most effective sanctions currently applied to the Russian state. While traditional Western sanctions focus on financial restrictions, trade embargoes, and technology bans, these military strikes bypass slow diplomatic channels and go straight to the mechanisms that keep Russia operational. Because they directly disrupt the systems that sustain the Russian economy, fuel processing, distribution networks, and the logistics that support both the civilian and military sectors, they have become a strategic lever capable of triggering what he described as gasoline riots. Gasoline riots, in his framing, are not metaphorical. They represent a potential wave of internal unrest driven by fuel shortages, long queues at petrol stations, rising transportation costs, and the creeping perception that the state is losing control over something as basic as fuel availability. Historically, sudden spikes in fuel prices or shortages have sparked protests across the world, even in relatively stable democracies. In an authoritarian system like Russia's, where political expression is already constrained, anger over something as tangible as fuel can become a lightning rod for broader dissatisfaction. From Caesar's perspective, these refinery strikes are not solely military actions. They are a form of economic warfare, calibrated to gradually erode Russia's internal cohesion. He assessed that if Ukraine continues applying pressure with long-range drones and missiles, Russia's internal order could falter, as fuel shortages disrupt movement, supply chains, and everyday life for ordinary citizens. Without fuel, he stated bluntly, logistics in the modern world are simply impossible. That single point ties a domestic economic collapse directly to frontline outcomes. Around 7:15 a.m., Caesar explained that the future tempo of fighting would depend almost entirely on one factor: whether Putin decides to pursue a new wave of mobilization. In his assessment, attack density, assault frequency, and sector-by-sector pressure would all be downstream effects of that decision. If mobilization begins, even on a limited scale, Ukrainian forces will feel the consequences in a very concrete way. Russian commanders will gain a larger pool of manpower to throw into assault waves, enabling them to maintain or increase pressure on multiple axes. This could translate into more frequent probing attacks, heavier infantry pushes, and an attempt to exhaust Ukraine's defensive lines through sheer numbers, regardless of the cost and casualties. However, Caesar stressed that Russia's custodial and controlled recruitment pools are now largely depleted. The initial waves of mobilization and earlier recruitment drives drew heavily from prisons, marginalized communities, and regions with weaker local resistance. Many of those who could be easily compelled or enticed into serving have already been mobilized. This means the Kremlin can no longer draw significant numbers of fighters from criminal populations or other easily controlled groups without damaging internal security and overstraining already tense institutions. Any new wave of mobilization will therefore have to pull personnel from sectors that Russia can't easily afford to lose: industry, transportation, construction, energy, and other strategic areas already strained by sanctions and wartime spending. Caesar underlined this point, emphasizing that the people mobilized now will come disproportionately from essential sectors that keep the Russian economy functioning day to day. Removing them will, in his view, destabilize Russia from within, because each conscripted worker will leave behind a gap in production, maintenance, or services that the state is ill-positioned to fill. By 11 a.m., under growing manpower pressure, Russian forces were observed pushing across many sectors simultaneously. Instead of carefully coordinated combined arms operations, Caesar described a pattern relying on brute force. Russian units press forward in multiple directions, accept high casualties, and reinforce only where they see localized success. This approach prioritizes overwhelming weight over precision or synergy, with assault groups probing for weak spots and attempting to exploit any discovered breakthrough with quickly assembled reserves. Ukraine, he argued, must counter this asymmetric advantage in manpower by strengthening its own strike capabilities, particularly in the deep rear. Rather than trying to match Russia soldier for soldier, Ukraine's strategy should be to keep degrading the infrastructure and industrial base that sustains those soldiers. This is where the strikes on refineries, ammunition depots, repair facilities, and transportation hubs come into play. Caesar continued by stating that Ukraine's long-range weapons, naval drones, strike UAVs, and deep strike missiles have become the country's most impactful sanctions package. These systems, when directed at oil refineries, military production plants, and logistics hubs, generate economic losses and operational disruption far greater than any diplomatic measure currently in force. A financial sanction can take months or years to fully bite. A successful strike can disable a refinery unit in minutes and cost billions in lost output over time. According to Caesar, if this pace of strikes continues, Russia may soon reach a breaking point where fuel shortages cause systemic paralysis. In such a scenario, not only would frontline units suffer from a lack of diesel and aviation fuel, but civilian life would experience cascading disruptions as trucking, rail transport, agriculture, and industry all feel the shock simultaneously. The perception of the state's strength, so central to Putin's political narrative, would be severely undermined if citizens see long fuel lines, shuttered factories, and visible shortages. By 1:40 p.m., Caesar turned his attention to Putin's current political strategy. He argued that the Kremlin's top leadership is attempting to demoralize Ukrainian society and leadership through repeated missile and drone attacks on civilian areas, particularly during critical periods such as summer and autumn.
These attacks seek to create a sense of constant vulnerability, to exhaust air defenses, and to push Ukraine's population toward war weariness. However, Caesar interpreted this escalation differently. He contended that these repeated strikes on civilian infrastructure and residential areas reflect a state of hysteria within Russia's political elite. Military planners and policymakers, he suggested, are frustrated by the army's inability to achieve decisive battlefield gains within the boundaries of the Geneva Conventions and broader international law. Unable to demonstrate major victories at the front, they resort to punitive civilian strikes to project an image of power and maintain an illusion of momentum. In his view, this behavior reveals a deeper weakness. Resorting to attacks on civilian areas does not simply violate international norms, it demonstrates a fundamental lack of confidence in the military's capacity to win through conventional